Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference on toxic safety, flame retardants, chemical controversies, and environmental health with Dr. Alissa Cordner. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. I sent a link to Dr. Cordner's presentation to everyone who signed up for the call. If you haven't done so already, please take a moment to download the presentation so you can follow along. And you can also find the link on our homepage at akaction.org. We are so pleased that Dr. Cordner had the time to present today, as the publication of her book, Toxic Safety, couldn't be more timely for Alaskans. The Alaska State Legislature is currently considering the Toxic Free Children's Act, which is Senate Bill 111, House Bill 199. It's a bill that would ban 10 toxic flame retardants in children's products and furniture. Later on the call, Pam Miller, Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, will give us an update on the legislation. It's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Alissa Cordner, as I first met her in the summer of 2010 when she spent the summer interning with Alaska Community Action on Toxics, where she helped with our community-based environmental health research field institute. And she also traveled to St. Lawrence Island to meet with community leaders. Dr. Alissa Cordner is now an assistant professor of sociology at Whitman College, where she teaches sociology and environmental studies courses. Her research interests include environmental sociology, environmental health and justice, risk and disasters, science and knowledge, social movements, and policy and participation. She received her Ph.D. in sociology from Brown University. Her work has been published in numerous journals, and she is also a fellow in the National Science Foundation-funded program called Enabling the Next Generation of Hazards and Disasters Researchers. Welcome, Alissa. You may go ahead and begin.
Thank you so much, Diana and Pam. It's really wonderful to be on the call today, and I'm very happy to be able to talk about my book and also talk more about the Toxic Free Children's Act up in Alaska. I am an environmental sociologist, and my research in a really broad way focuses on how people and institutions make decisions about environmental risks, especially when there is incomplete information or a significant degree of uncertainty about future environmental risks. And risk is really a central concern in many aspects of life. So many of the things that we do and think about every day are framed in terms of risk, both within the environmental field as well as outside of it. Risk matters for environmental sociology, my field, because it's really at the heart of how we interpret the environment, how we analyze environmental problems, and how we try to prevent the consequences of environmental problems. Next slide. So today I'll be presenting work from my book, Toxic Safety, which has just been released by Columbia University Press. Next slide. My book explores three main research questions. First, how do stakeholders engaged in the field of flame retardant chemicals define and act upon the risks and hazards of those chemicals? Second, what is the role of scientific knowledge in decision-making about chemical risks, and specifically about the risk of flame retardants? And third, what are the implications of stakeholders' different risk assessment paradigms for chemicals use and regulation in the U.S.? In my presentation today, I'll focus on the first research question, and I'll also describe some of the history of how flame retardant chemicals have been studied and regulated in the United States. Next slide. So to answer the questions that I focus on in my book, I used an innovative multi-site qualitative methodology to study formal and informal risk assessment processes across the full range of stakeholders involved in the flame retardant debate. I conducted participant observation at a flame retardant manufacturer's research and development lab, at 2 offices within the Environmental Protection Agency, with an environmental chemistry lab at an academic institution, and with an environmental health nonprofit. I also conducted 116 in-depth interviews with a full range of stakeholders, including, in addition to the folks who I worked with at those 5 sites of participant observation, including people like firefighters, fire safety activists, and people working for companies along the supply chain. I also drew extensively on the public scientific literature, as well as internal documents from my 5 field sites that guided my analysis. and publicly available documents such as press releases and web pages. I transcribed all of the interviews, wrote up field notes from my participant observation sites, and I conducted coding in a qualitative computer program that allows for the coding of data called in vivo. All of my respondents and participants are anonymized, and I don't disclose the name of the flame retardant company I worked with, the location of the academic chemistry lab, or the name of the environmental health nonprofit. My research was funded by a 3-year fellowship from the EPA's Science to Achieve Result program and by a National Science Foundation grant to Professor Phil Brown, who's now at Northeastern University. So next slide, on to slide 5. To set the stage broadly for this topic, my book focuses on controversies over industrial chemicals with a focus on flame retardants. There are roughly 100,000 chemicals that have been inventoried in the U.S. This includes the industrial chemicals like flame retardants, as well as pharmaceuticals, food contact chemicals, pesticides, herbicides, and chemicals used by the military. We know that we are exposed to many of these chemicals, and we carry levels of them in our bodies. There's also growing scientific, regulatory, and social movement attention to individual chemicals as environmental health problems. As one environmental activist said in an interview, we are in the midst of a, quote, uncontrolled chemistry experiment, end quote, with all of these chemicals interacting with our bodies on a daily basis. However, exposure and toxicity data is frequently lacking. EPA researchers estimate that only 20% of chemicals that are in use today have any measured data on how widely people are exposed to them. And of the 10,000 high and moderate production volume chemicals currently in use in the U.S., that is the chemicals that are most widely used, 1/3 of those chemicals have no toxicity data whatsoever, and less than 30% have high quality toxicity data. So there are really significant data gaps around industrial chemicals generally. Next slide. So my case study focused on flame retardant chemicals and their risks as a case study of these contested environmental health problems. Flame retardants are widely used as additives to consumer and household products, ranging from car interiors to electronics to furniture. There are two types of flame retardants, many types of flame retardants that you might have heard of, even though there are actually hundreds of individual chemicals and mixtures. The most commonly discussed ones are the PBDEs, or polybrominated diphenyl ethers. These have been used, different formulations have been used in furniture and electronics, and one of these, DecaBDE, is part of the Alaska Proposed Toxic-Free Children's Act. Other chemicals include the brominated and chlorinated tris compounds. Several of these became infamous for their use in children's pajamas in the 1970s. And until recently, chlorinated tris components were widely used in furniture foam, although it appears that manufacturers are moving away from chlorinated tris onto other compounds. TBBPA is widely used in printed circuit boards. HBCD is used in electronics, and Firemaster 550 is a furniture foam flame retardant developed as a replacement for penta-BDE, which contains brominated and phosphorus-based flame retardants as well. So there's a lot of different chemicals in this class of flame retardants more generally, and there's a lot of growing research that many of these compounds do pose a significant concern for health or exposure. Next slide, on slide 7. Flame retardants are a particularly interesting example of an environmental health controversy because these compounds were developed and marketed as serving an identifiable public health function, reducing the risk of fires. Fire deaths have declined significantly from over 12,000 a year in the early 1970s to around 3,000 in 2014. However, these declines appear to be largely driven not by the addition of flame retardants to consumer products, but due to other social factors, especially lower smoking rates and the proliferation of home smoke detectors, factors like that. Recently, environmental groups and scientists have actually argued that flame retardants are not effective in real-life fire scenarios because they're typically added to things like the foam inside of furniture, and in fact, they can actually increase the toxicity of smoke when fires do occur because they slow combustion, leading to a greater output of smoke. Unfortunately, we know that most people who die in home fires die not from the actual flames, but from smoke inhalation. So it's possible that by increasing the amount of smoke released into the air, these compounds in some situations may actually increase the danger from fires. As a result, there's been some movement away from the addition of flame retardants to furniture foam in particular, and a recent decision in California revised a flammability standard that had set a national standard for the use of flame retardants in furniture foam, so that now that standard can be met without the addition of flame retardant chemicals to the interior foam of a couch, for example. Despite these controversies over the effectiveness of these chemicals, U.S. demand for flame retardants is only on the increase and is predicted to reach nearly £1 billion in 2016. It remains a very widespread and profitable industry. Next slide. Exposure to flame retardants is widespread. Over 97% of U.S. adults have measurable levels of PBDE flame retardants in their bodies, for example, but exposure is not evenly distributed across the population. Research has documented that minorities and the poor carry higher levels of some flame retardants in their bodies. Most of these studies have looked at flame retardants that are widely used in furniture foam and electronics, and the suspicion is that as these products degrade, higher levels of these chemicals are released, and so people who tend to own older furniture or electronics may be exposed to higher levels. We also know that children have higher levels of flame retardants in their bodies than adults do, because children spend more time on the floor, have more hand-to-mouth behavior, so they have a greater risk of ingestion of these chemicals, and because their bodies metabolize flame retardants and other compounds differently than adults do. On to slide 9. We're starting to learn more about the health effects of flame retardant exposure for people, and most of that research is focusing on PBDE flame retardants because these were widely used up until the mid to late 2000s, and they've been the focus of a significant amount of scientific research. Results from animal and laboratory studies suggest that exposure to PBDEs and some other flame retardants may have serious health consequences. Health studies in humans are just starting to come out and have found that PBDE exposure is linked to health effects, including decreased IQ and behavioral changes in children, decreased fertility in women, low birth weight, and differential hormone levels in men and women. Next slide. Flame retardants have become a poster child for our chemicals regulatory and production system. As one environmental activist told me in an interview, quote, "It's a really good example of what we call the whack-a-mole problem. You know, you get rid of one bad chemical only to have another one crop up, then you try to get rid of that one, then another one, and it's like they're equally as bad. We don't know whether or not it's safe," end quote. In the flame retardant story, as one chemical has been banned or voluntarily removed from commerce, another chemical has quickly taken its place, usually with similar chemistries and usually without competing science to support assertions that the replacement chemical is, in fact, a safer choice. Next slide. Part of this pattern of regrettable substitution is driven by the chemical industry. They often develop new chemicals that have similar chemistries but slightly different properties. There's a desire to maintain an existing market share, and there's a need from supply chain manufacturers, the folks like the furniture manufacturers or the electronics manufacturers, to be able to easily substitute new chemicals. But this is also driven by an outdated chemical regulatory system in the U.S. Flame retardants have been regulated chemical by chemical at the state, federal, and international levels. In the U.S., industrial chemicals like flame retardants are regulated under the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, which I'll talk about in just a moment. States have taken the lead in regulating several types of flame retardants before action was taken at the federal level. And flame retardants can also be subject to regulation through the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Internationally, Europe has acted much more quickly than the U.S. Sweden banned PBDEs in the late 1990s, and the European Union has followed suit. Next slide. Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, is the system for regulating industrial chemicals in the U.S., and it's done through the Environmental Protection Agency. However, there are significant limitations of TSCA. First, the EPA has limited authority to impose regulations on the roughly 62,000 chemicals that were grandfathered in when TSCA was enacted. These are called existing chemicals. The agency is thus caught in a data catch-22, as agency people told me, where they cannot require further testing or restrictions on a chemical without data already demonstrating that the chemicals pose a risk. So they can't develop the data until they have the data that the chemicals are risky. As a result, the TSCA has been able to regulate to force restrictions on only 5 chemicals, since it was enacted in 1976. It has not been able to regulate any existing chemicals through Section 8 since it tried unsuccessfully to regulate asbestos in the 1990s. And it has only been able to require data development or new toxicity or exposure testing on about 210 chemicals out of the many thousands of chemicals that we know are of potential concern. EPA must also justify all of their risk-based decisions as being the least burdensome on the economy, on companies, on society as a whole. And it must justify these decisions using cost-benefit analysis. It also is able to require very limited data on newly developed chemicals. Only approximately 1/3, according to EPA sources, only about 1/3 of chemicals are submitted for review with any data at all, and very, very few chemicals are submitted with long-term toxicity or multi-generational or cancer studies in animals. Many chemicals are also exempt from full reporting under TSCA based on exemptions for low-volume production or polymeric design. And a final significant concern about TSCA is the amount of data that manufacturers can claim as confidential business information, which includes the chemical structure, how the chemical will be used, how it is produced, even how much is going to be produced, leaving the public unable to evaluate toxicity or exposure concerns independently. Both chambers of Congress at the federal level have passed federal TSCA reform bills. The Frank-Laudenberg Chemical Safety for the 21st Century Act, passed by the Senate, and the TSCA Modernization Act 2015, passed by the House. However, both of these bills have significant limitations regarding the treatment of confidential business information, the preemption of state regulations, limited funding mechanisms, and limited numbers of new chemicals that will be evaluated. Many observers do expect the two chambers to align their bills this spring and send something to President Obama for his signature, but it really remains to be seen whether this will produce meaningful TSCA reform or whether it will just be a change to a system that doesn't improve public health significantly. Next slide, on to slide 13. So as a result of the failures of chemicals regulation at the federal level, environmental and health activists have focused much attention on state-based regulation. They've developed a broad coalition against flame retardant chemicals that is situated within the broader environmental health movement, but includes a number of unexpected players, including ecologists, legislators, breastfeeding advocates, furniture manufacturers and other industry representatives, firefighters and fire safety activists, and burn victim activists. This wide range of organizations involved demonstrates the breadth of topics of concern in the flame retardant arena. Whether you are a breastfeeding advocate concerned about breast milk purity, a conservationist angry that wildlife is contaminated by industrial pollutants, or an anti-toxics activist wanting to reform chemicals regulation, flame retardants are an issue that you can rally around. And people told me in interviews this is a good campaign to work on for many reasons. First, there's clear scientific research showing that, in particular, some of the halogenated flame retardants, including PBDEs and the gluchlorinated tris varieties, are often hazardous to human health and the environment. There's also very clear alternative chemicals and technologies that are preferable to some of the chemicals that are widespread today. It is also possible to target a relatively small and identifiable industry. Advocates told me that having this identifiable target clarifies their messaging and improves the likelihood of campaign victories. And finally, flame retardant bans are seen as more winnable than some other chemical bans because they have an identifiable constituency in mothers who are concerned that flame retardants accumulate in breast milk, are measured in cord blood, and can be transmitted to children who we know are more vulnerable to their health effects. In particular, advocates have rallied around a framing around children's health. And this children's health frame, as one advocate told me, is both accurate in its scientific foundations and successful in its appeal to the public and decision makers. Next slide. Another key strategy by the Flame Retardant Coalition has been to work with occupational groups, including firefighters, transportation workers, flight attendants, and pilots. Firefighters in particular have played a particularly important role in successful campaigns against flame retardants. And according to my interviews, this is the first example of firefighters directly participating in environmentally oriented activism that's not specific about firehouse safety. Activists and legislators alike give significant credit to firefighters for the success of these chemical reforms. In the words of one firefighter, quote, "There isn't a government or legislative body that's going to pass a ban on flame retardants unless the fire service weighs in and has some significant involvement," end quote. Health is a really significant concern for firefighters because they, like many first responders, have elevated rates of many types of cancers and other illnesses that are potentially linked to the toxic chemicals, including flame retardants, that they breathe in smoke when they go in to respond to a fire. Next slide. Most activism on flame retardant restrictions has focused on changing regulations at the state level. Since the very first state ban on penta-BDE in 2003, over a dozen states have passed specific bans on flame retardants. Most recently, Washington State passing just signing, I think yesterday or the day before, a flame retardant ban. And several have also developed a more comprehensive system to evaluate and regulate chemicals, including a chemicals of concern list or a requirement for alternatives assessment and testing. Activists have pursued what they call this patchwork quilt of state-level chemicals regulations in order to convince product manufacturers, the chemical industry, and state and federal legislators that sweeping federal change is in fact needed. And these state-level actions are motivated by their knowledge of the potential for federal change. Although TSCA reform is seen as the ultimate goal, activists often believe that state-level action is more likely, especially in some progressive states. As one activist told me, quote, "Chemicals management policy should come from the federal government, but until this happens, the states will take action." Flame retardant activists also frequently engage in market campaigns and relationship building with industries. They focus on the full supply chain from the chemical manufacturers all the way to consumer sales. And these have been often quite successful, especially at targets in the baby product sector or children's product sector. For example, in 2012, several bloggers and activists targeted the baby products company Graco after studies found chlorinated tris in its strollers. Within a week, an online petition asking the company to remove flame retardants from their products, disclose all materials, and turn to safer alternatives had gathered thousands of signatures. And soon after, Graco contacted the campaign leaders to say that they would stop using the two controversial chemicals, and they actually wrote a collaborative press release with the NGOs announcing the reformulation. So this type of retail regulation and market campaigns have been very successful. In opposition to flame retardant bans and restrictions, we have several organizations that come out of the flame retardant industry itself. These corporate activists use similar strategies as the environmental health activists often use, including direct lobbying, writing letters to elected officials, publishing op-eds or letters to the editor, and gathering petition signatures. The corporate advocacy on the behalf of flame retardant companies has been remarkably well funded. In California, for example, which in many ways has been the epicenter of flame retardant contests, the industry spent over $11 million on lobbying between 2007 and 2011 alone. Several organizations have been active in this arena, including Citizens for Fire Safety, which was a funded organization, an organization that was funded by the flame retardant industry and is no longer active. The Bromine Science and Environmental Forum, which is based in Europe and is run by a lobbying firm. And then most currently, the American Chemistry Council's North American Flame Retardant Alliance, or NAFRA. The American Chemistry Council, or ACC, is the trade association for the U.S. chemical industry. And in 2014, for example, it spent over $11 million on lobbying and gave over $500,000 in campaign contributions, making it the 26th largest lobbying operation in the country. NAFRA, the ACC's panel on flame retardant advocacy, is made up of the three largest flame retardant manufacturers, Albemarle, Chemtura, and ICL-IP. And it describes itself as the lead advocacy organization in North America for flame retardant producers and users. So having described the history of flame retardant use, regulation, and research in the U.S., I want to turn now to some findings out of my research focusing on risk and risk formulas. So if you go on to the next slide, slide 17, I'll introduce the idea of conceptual risk formulas. Environmental health problems are frequently studied and regulated in terms of risk. In common parlance, risk refers to the danger of something, a quality that incorporates both its inherent hazards, or how dangerous something is, how severe the consequences might be, and also how likely that hazard is to occur, whether something is in fact dangerous to a given population, and this is often equated with exposure or probability. Additionally, risk assessment must incorporate uncertainty about both hazard and exposure into a holistic assessment. As an environmental sociologist, there are many theories around risk definition that I drew on in my book, and I won't talk about them now, but I'm happy to dive into them in Q&A if people have questions about my theoretical foundations. So next slide. In my research, I found that stakeholders did not have one singular definition of risk. They did not all mean the same thing when they talked about risk or when they used the word risk. Instead, they discussed and operationalized risk using 6 different formulas. These are things that I discovered over the course of my research, not that necessarily people who I was talking to would have identified one of these formulas themselves, but in going through and analyzing my data, I found these 6 ways that people tended to talk about risk. These are ways of identifying the components of chemical risk and the relationship between these components. And these conceptual risk formulas matter because they outline the parameters of future risk management practices. Before stakeholders can disagree about whether a flame retardant or any chemical poses a risk to human health or the environment, those stakeholders have to identify how risk should be calculated in general. So I identified these 6 formulas: the classic risk formula, the exposure-centric risk formula, the either-or risk formula, the emerging toxicology risk formula, the exposure proxy risk formula, and the hazard-centric risk formula. And for the sake of time, I'm going to briefly discuss 3 of them, but I'm happy to talk about the others in Q&A at the end. So the first risk formula that I'll talk about is the classic risk formula. You may have heard people describe some version of what I call the classic risk formula, that risk is a function of hazard and exposure, or risk is a function of severity times likelihood. Indeed, that's how I introduced the concept of risk a few minutes ago. As an example from my interviews, an EPA chemist used an unusual metaphor. He said, quote, "When we go to the zoo, you know, there are hungry bears and horrible carnivores there. Why are we not concerned when we go to the zoo? I almost think of them as being 2 numbers multiplied together. There's the hazard component, there's the exposure component, and if the exposure component is 0, which it is ideally, the fence is tall enough to hold in the bear, then the exposure is 0. Even though the hazard is a really big number, any big number times 0 is 0. So the idea here is that risk is a function of hazard times exposure. And I want to highlight 2 features of this formula. First, it assumes a linear relationship between dose or exposure and response or impact. Therefore, as either exposure or hazard increases or decreases, the risk will change proportionately. This indeed is a foundational tenet of the discipline of toxicology. The dose makes the poison. As a regulatory toxicologist told me, quote, "When you talk about risk, the hazard can be very high, but if you're not exposed to it, then obviously there's no risk. Conversely, you can have a very low hazard, but if you're eating a pound of it every day, the risk can be very, very high." Second point is that because this is a multiplicative relationship, the absence of data in either the hazard or exposure category leads to a calculation that there is no risk because the equation can be zeroed out if either hazard or exposure is not deemed to be sufficiently significant. This risk formula I found to be widespread in environmental regulation, including at the EPA, in public discourse, and in the chemical industry. Next slide. The next risk formula is the exposure-centric risk formula. And this is an industry-driven approach that does several things. First, it downplays the importance of hazard because of its focus on exposure. And second, it assumes that we can actually control exposure, and therefore we can minimize potential for risk. In practice, it's very difficult to minimize exposure, and we often identify after the fact exposure routes and pathways that were not expected. But within this formula, the formula assumes that risk is a function of hazard and then a multifaceted assessment of exposure, including whether the physical chemical properties of the compound itself would lead us to think exposure is possible, how the product is used, so if the use itself would lead us to think exposure is likely, what the exposure pathways are people exposed through ingestion or dermal exposure, for example, and then finally actual measured levels of a compound in the environment and in people. So you see that the idea is that exposure itself is multifaceted, and requires a significant amount of data. For example, as one industry representative told me, for us, for the industry, risk is a balance of exposure as well as toxicity. If a chemical is being used in a banner that's in an awning or something, it's not going to come into contact very often, so it's not as much of a concern. So the idea here is that if a product is being used in something that should not have a use scenario that leads to significant exposure, we don't need to worry about whether the chemical is likely to accumulate in the body, whether there are in fact documented levels in the environment, or whether there are known exposure pathways for that chemical. And therefore, the idea is that exposure and therefore risk can be controlled through proper handling and manufacturing techniques. Indeed, this has been the focus of the flame retardant industry's exposure reduction program, not on changing the physical chemical properties of a compound or focusing on consumer exposure, but on looking at manufacturing techniques and how to make them more efficient. This, as I said, is the formula that's widespread in the chemical industry, and you can see how it allows the risk formula to, even more than the classic risk formula, allows this formula to be zeroed out to arrive at a determination of little to no risk. Next slide. The third risk formula I want to talk about is in stark contrast to these two, and this I call the either-or risk formula. This is a formula that I only observed coming from folks on the environmental health advocacy end of the spectrum, and it tends to equate risk either with hazard or with exposure, whichever is more concerning or whichever shows cause for concern. This formula explicitly rejects a multiplicative relationship between hazard and exposure, or the requirement that both be documented before action can be taken, and involves an explicit critique of multiplicative risk assessment, largely because of an emphasis on how much uncertainty there is around environmental health science. So from this perspective, it does not make sense to require significant data on both hazard and exposure because we know there are so many data gaps out there in the environmental health world. Therefore, if significant cause for concern emerges in either the hazard or the exposure and side of the story, we should take action as a result. So one activist told me, we prefer a hazards-based approach, which is let's look at the chemicals. If it's hazardous, don't use it. So here you can see acting just based on hazard assessment. And then on acting just based on exposure assessment, a different activist said, you don't even have to show a health effect. If you're showing that these chemicals are getting into my body, that trespass is unauthorized. People in particular talked about specific types of toxicity as triggering this risk formula, for example, any known carcinogens or chemicals that are known to cause reproductive toxicity. And they talked about specific types of exposures, in particular any chemicals that are measured in cord blood or measured in breast milk. And as I said, this formula was most widespread among environmental and health activist circles. Next slide. So to conclude, at the root of these questions of risk definition is the question of safety. What does a safe chemical look like, and how will we know it when we see it? I argue that risk definition is strategic on the part of these stakeholders because it establishes the parameters for how risk assessment and management activities can proceed and what information is required and included. Risk definition is regularly accompanied by assertions and claims that extend beyond scientific evidence. For example, the either-or risk formula is frequently accompanied by an ethical assertion that chemicals should not enter into infants' bodies before they are born or into women's breast milk. Similarly, the exposure-centric risk formula is regularly accompanied by claims about cost-benefit analysis and the need to maintain chemicals in the marketplace. Risk definition can also be used to buttress dramatically different regulatory models, such as a reactionary risk management system like our current chemicals regulatory system that's based on a classic risk formula and protects the status quo, or a precautionary risk management system that allows for policy action to be taken even in the absence of scientific certainty around hazard and exposure levels. Thus, risk definitions can be used to either protect markets or to protect public health, demonstrating that risk definition becomes another tool that can be used by industry to delay chemicals regulation and increase profits, or used by activists to push for precautionary turns in environmental health regulation. This means that environmental sociologists should be paying attention to risk management across the full range of issues that we look at, and especially paying attention to how institutions and actors with identifiable stakes in policy outcomes and different levels of power, define these risks within policy controversies. It also means that risk definition matters for legislators, regulators, activists, and practitioners because it can allow them to more fully understand where people are coming from, how they are defining the words they are using, to more fully understand people who are coming to the table from different perspectives using the same words but with dramatically different meanings. And this allows them to potentially identify biases and improve risk management activities going forward. Last slide. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Pam more about what's going on in Alaska and looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Cordner. Thank you so much. And before we move on to questions and discussion, I would like to invite Pam Miller, Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, to give us an update on the Toxic Free Children's Act.
Great. Thank you, Diana. And Alissa, congratulations on the publishing of your book, and it's so good to hear about your important research, and good to hear your voice again. So I'll just give a quick overview about SB 111. On the House side, it's HB 199. We call it the Toxic Free Children's Act. And this is an act that would prevent the manufacture, sale, and distribution of 10 toxic and unnecessary flame retardant chemicals that are used in children's products and in home furniture. It would also require the labeling of children's products and upholstered furniture to inform people about whether these products contain toxic flame retardant chemicals. So we think this is a very important measure to protect children's health and especially vulnerable populations, including firefighters. We have a lot of broad support from groups such as the Alaska Federation of Natives, the Alaska Professional Firefighters Association, the Alaska Nurses Association, many businesses, and health advocates. So the bill is getting a lot of great public support. It was introduced last April on the Senate side by Senator Bill Wielechowski and on the House side by Representative Harriet Drummond. So we're very grateful to both of them for taking leadership on this important public health issue. So far this session, which is in session right now, the bill has had a hearing in the Senate Labor and Commerce Committee chaired by Senator Mia Costello. And we're very happy to say that this bill was passed out of that committee. And now the most important thing is that the bill is scheduled or is referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee. However, the chair of that committee, Senator Liesl McGuire, has not yet scheduled a hearing. So your action is needed now, really, to compel Senator McGuire and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee to hold a hearing to hear from Alaskans about the importance of this bill and to make sure that it gets passed this session. And then on the House side, we're asking people to contact Representative Kurt Olson, who is the chair of the House Labor and Commerce Committee, where the bill is referred first in the House. And as you know, the legislative session ends April 17th, so we really need to act quickly. Our legislators need to take action now to make sure that this bill passes. So we really could use your support and energy in assuring that this happens and to hold our legislators accountable. So I'll stop there and welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. And again, I'd like to thank Dr. Cordner and Pam for presenting today and all of you for calling in. And now we would like to invite questions and comments from our participants. So if you'd like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. And please also state your name and affiliation. We will need to end our discussion on time today, as Dr. Cordner does have another commitment. But that still gives us a good 15 minutes or so. So again, press *2 to unmute your line. It does look like I have someone who unmuted, but I'm not hearing anybody speak up.
Yeah, this is Andy Lindstrom from the US EPA at Research Triangle Park in North Carolina. Thanks very much for the very informative presentation. I enjoyed it very much. It's very eye-opening and nice to see this kind of research where you're working with NGOs and academics and chemical manufacturers and the regulatory community as well. I think it's a very admirable and holistic kind of approach to paint the entire picture to give everybody an idea of how complicated these problems are, and I think it ultimately helps get to a better understanding and hopefully a better solution to these types of problems. And I was particularly interested in your definitions of risk, and you're in the end saying that some of these definitions serve to protect markets versus protecting public health, and I think we've all seen situations where the interpretation of risk is protecting a market to the detriment of public health, and I think of things like lead or tobacco smoke or oil spills or things like that. And I'm wondering if you would care to comment on, are you aware of any situation where we've had legislation or definitions of risk that are too protective of public health, where we've been too conservative and gone too far the other way instead of protecting the markets?
Well, thanks, Andy. That's a really interesting question. Within the flame retardant story, the moments where flame retardants they've typically been removed from commerce voluntarily within some sort of follow-up regulation. The story that those examples, my discussions with scientists and regulators, I would say that those were not too protective of public health. I think there are always going to be value judgments that come into play when you are making decisions in the face of such significant scientific uncertainty. So if you really wait for scientific certainty about whether a chemical is impacting human health, then you are waiting for evidence of, in the case of flame retardants, decreased fertility in women or a behavioral or IQ reductions in children. You're waiting for these really obvious health effects. And at that point, it seems like the line of protecting public health has already been crossed. So I would not point to any examples within the flame retardant story of risk assessment being used in a way that's overly protective of public health, or perhaps just erring very far on that end of the spectrum. I do think that it's quite possible for an assessment of risk to be both protective of public health and protective of our ability to use chemicals when they're serving a valuable function in society. And I think that a really important way to look at that would be through a risk formula that I didn't talk about today, but is the hazard-centric risk formula, which looks at chemicals within a certain functional class and looks for the safest, based on the best available evidence, what are the safest options out there? What are the least hazardous chemicals that could fulfill the same function? And if we're making decisions that err on the side of using something that we know is safe, then we're still allowing for that functional chemical group to do its job, whether it's serving as a flame retardant in an electronic or whether it is protecting the durability of a hard plastic. We're still allowing that chemical functionality to continue and thus protecting markets. And by looking across within that functional group to identify alternatives that might have less known or suspected concerns for toxicity or exposure, that would allow us to protect public health at the same time. So I do hope that there are ways for us in the future to do things that are both protective of markets when those markets are serving a really valuable function and protect public health in the face of uncertainty.
Thank you. If there's someone else out there who would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *2 to unmute your line.
Hi, this is Patty in Anchorage. I have a sort of messy question. The first is that my understanding is with things like endocrine disrupting chemicals, the dose, or the amount of those chemicals that interferes with our endocrine system is, maybe parts per billion, as opposed to even parts per million, which is what we are. Those of us who think about risk have been taught to think about it in terms of parts per million, when we need to be thinking about it, in another different order of magnitude. And so how does that come into the exposure piece? I mean, if the exposure is teeny, teeny, tiny, that's all it takes to, affect a developing child's brain, well, then there's the calculation by itself, hazard times exposure, it doesn't, how does that work? And the other piece, of course, in regard to that is that none of those systems that we discussed, the three top ones that we discussed today, talk about chemical mixtures. We are all exposed to more than one chemical. And so why is it that nobody is requiring the chemical industry to say, well, if you mix my chemical with their chemical and you're exposed to both of them, then you're really up the creek without a paddle. To say, I don't know. It just seems to me like it's as complicated as what you suggested today. There's a further level of complication that is critically important in this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Patty. To touch on your second question first, the issue of mixtures and also the issue of cumulative exposure is really important, and one that is very difficult, if not impossible, to address within our current regulatory system. There are, I would say, a growing number of scientists, within EPA and also outside of government who are looking at these issues of cumulative and additive exposure to try and ask these questions. But there are a lot of scientific and regulatory barriers, scientific in terms of sort of the practice of science, how we typically study chemicals. It has always been one at a time. So I think you're absolutely right. It's very, very messy, and it's much messier than just chemical by chemical. To talk about the low-dose exposure issue, another one of the conceptual risk formulas that I heard come up frequently in interviews, especially with regulators and environmental health scientists, I call the exposure, the emerging toxicology risk formula. And this looks exactly at what you're talking about how we can't just think about exposure as being some sort of one-size-fits-all measure. And so what that formula does is complicate the exposure component to look at things like timing of exposure. So you mentioned issues of fetal exposure, childhood exposure. We know that there are these really critical windows of susceptibility to chemical exposure. So that risk formula says it's not enough just to know what level someone is exposed to. You have to also know at what point in their life were they exposed, what are their individual susceptibilities. And so it is trying to complicate that notion of exposure to say it's not enough to just look at one dose and assume that dose is the same for all people. And I think that there's certainly growing attention to issues of low-dose exposure, issues of timing of exposure within the field of toxicology and environmental toxicology, and within some regulatory programs, such as the EPA's endocrine disruptor screening program.
Thank you, Patty and Alissa. And it looks like there are a few other people who've unmuted their lines.
So this is Mary Gant with the Green Policy Science Institute. In response to the question about has a regulation been too protective, watching environmental health issues for a very long time, the only thing I can think of is that the National Toxicology Program has delisted a handful of chemicals from its report on carcinogen because new science showed that they weren't of the concern that they were originally thought to be. And you can get that list from the NTP program.
Thank you. That's a really interesting place to look. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. This is Steve Seymour from Green Cape in Massachusetts. And I had a question. We're having a big issue here, as there's a lot of places in the country, with the PFCs, the perfluorinated chemicals in the water. And I'm an engineer looking at it from a certain perspective. And this is very interesting about the different ways of looking at risk, because what what I haven't been able to find good literature other than what the standard is, which doesn't seem to be adequate in many cases. And the perfluorinated chemicals, another aspect of it is these are also very long-term chemicals in our groundwater. We drink our groundwater on Cape Cod here, where I live in Massachusetts. And I made my own decision once I had heard that there was some in our water to not drink the water at all in the area that had it in. And I wondered how we get out of this where we have problems that go on, and we're actually right now there's no EPA actual standard other than a recommendation, and so people are still drinking it, and people that are water purveyors are limited in what they feel that they can spend money on to try to clean it up, and it's all after the fact. And I guess I wondered which of those ones that you were talking about for risk assessments might have short-stopped that a long time ago.
That's a really interesting question. So I'm actually working with Phil Brown at Northeastern University on a new research project looking at the perfluorinated and polyfluorinated compounds. So definitely something that I'm thinking a lot about these days. And it's such a complicated story because, as you mentioned, of the longevity of these compounds, of their based on the different PFAS compounds, their ability to move through water at different speeds, and we're just starting to uncover more and more chemicals of concern within that class. And so I think its initiative is only going to get bigger and is really right now subject to some really interesting scientific limitations around what we're able to measure and how quickly. In terms of which of the conceptual risk formulas might have helped to sort of prevent some of those exposures at this point, perhaps looking back at an understanding of looking across a functional use category and identifying a chemical of less concern within that category. So if there was a way to, I know with a lot of the contaminated sites, either it's from an industry site or from a firefighting training location on a military base, if there's a way to use a different compound that has lower concerns for exposure toxicity, perhaps that could have prevented some of these contamination incidents. But it's easy for us to perhaps say that now when 20, 30, 40 years ago, there's a lot of background noise. Not there we go, that's a lot better.
Okay.
When these chemicals were initially being produced and used, we didn't have the same information that we might have today. And I think what that really points to are concerns with how chemicals are regulated broadly in the U.S. and how new chemicals require very little toxicity and exposure data before they're allowed to enter production, and really points to limitations at the federal level with the Toxic Substances Control Act and EPA's really limited ability to require testing on chemicals that have already been that were in use prior to 1976, as many of the PFAS compounds were. So I think more than suggesting a certain risk formula, I think it really points to the need for more comprehensive chemicals regulation reform.
And Sam, I'd like to just add something very briefly. Steve, I think you raised an incredibly important question here, and you may be familiar with the Madrid statement, which is a scientific consensus statement on concerns about perfluorinated compounds and a summary of the science on perfluorinated compounds. And this is a pervasive problem that we face across the country and around the world. And there was just a recent report, for instance, showing hundreds of Department of Defense sites that had contaminated groundwater because of the use of perfluorinated compounds used in firefighting foam. And now one of the perfluorinated compounds is nominated under the Stockholm Convention for Global Elimination, that's PFOA, which has implications for the entire class of perfluorinated compounds. So I think there's a lot of important work being done on these chemicals now from a scientific as well as a policy perspective. and it sounds like this is a topic we should have another entire on. So I thank you for your question, Steve.
Thank you, and I may have muted Steve. There was a lot of background noise, so I had to mute a few lines. Sorry to have done that. If somebody needs to speak again, you'll have to press star 2 again to unmute yourself. But we are running out of time, and I know that Dr. Cordner had agreed to take some questions by email if we couldn't get to them all, and her contact information is on the last slide of her presentation. Would you like to add anything else, Dr. Cordner, before I go on to my announcements?
I don't think so. I'm happy to take questions over email. I'm also happy to share a copy of the paper that published in the Journal of Environmental Studies and Sciences that introduces all 6 of the conceptual risk formulas. So if you'd like a copy of that, I'd be happy to share that. Or yeah, you can just email me. That would be great.
Okay, wonderful. So again, if we didn't get to your question, please go ahead and submit it directly to Dr. Cordner, or if you had a question about the legislation, you can contact ACAT. You can actually contact me at diana@akaction.org, and I'll make sure that your question gets into the right person's hands. So again, as a reminder, this call has been recorded, and we'll notify you when we've posted the MP3 to our website. Our next call will be on Wednesday, April 27th, with Dr. Ted Shetler, author of The Ecology of Breast Cancer, The Promise of Prevention and the Hope for Healing. And I'll be sending an email with a link to sign up for that later this week. Again, we would like to thank everyone for calling in today. And finally, I'd like to urge each of you to please consider making a donation in support of our Che Alaska calls. Each month we explore a timely environmental health topic, and we bring together leading experts in research and policy, as well as community leaders. Our goal is to advance knowledge to catalyze action, and your gift will provide the support we need to continue bringing you this great service. You can go to akaction.org and click on the donate button, and really any amount that you give will be greatly appreciated. So again, thank you to everyone. The phone number for ACAT is 907-222-7714 if you have additional questions or ideas for future topics for our calls. And thanks again. Have a wonderful day.